August 2nd, 1492. The harbour of Palos de la Frontera in southern Andalusia. The sun has gone down, and the air along the Tinto River is thick with salt and mud and the sharp smell of tar. Torches flicker on wooden piers, throwing unsteady light across the dark water. 3 small ships lie moored in the estuary, their masts swaying gently with the tide, the creak of timber on rope, the slap of water against hulls, and somewhere in the shadows along the wharf, the low murmur of nervous men. Tomorrow morning, roughly 90 sailors, officers, and anxious volunteers will board those ships and sail west into an ocean that no European has ever crossed and returned to tell about. They don't know what's out there. They don't know if they'll ever see Spain again. And tonight, on the last solid ground they'll stand on for weeks, maybe months, some of them are wondering if they've made a terrible mistake. If you're here to fall asleep, you're in exactly the right place. That's why I make these. So get comfortable, let your breathing slow, and let this story carry you across the Atlantic at the pace of the 15th century. One wave, one day, one small wooden ship at a time. And if you feel like it, go ahead and leave a comment. Tell me where you are and what time it is. I love seeing them. Tokyo at dawn, London at midnight, São Paulo on a lunch break, all of us listening to the same story, separated by centuries and oceans and time zones, but somehow all here together. So, what was it actually like? Not the history book version, not the myths or the murals or the monuments. What did it feel like, physically, emotionally, moment by moment, to be one of those 90 men climbing aboard a ship barely longer than a tennis court and pointing it toward the edge of the known world? What did you eat? Where did you sleep? What did the ocean sound like in the middle of the night when the wind dropped and the sails went slack? How did fear taste after 3 weeks at sea with no land in sight? And what went through your mind when finally, impossibly, a dark line appeared on the western horizon and you realized you weren't going to die out there after all? Over the next while, we're going to find out. We're going to walk the decks of those tiny ships, meet the sailors, the officers, the boys, the convicts. We're going to feel the Atlantic swell beneath our feet, choke down hardtack and salted cod, wake to the helmsman's call at the change of watch. We'll drift through seas choked with strange golden weeds, watch tensions rise as the voyage drags on longer than anyone expected, and stand on deck the night a distant firelight flickered across the water and changed the world forever. But first, let's start where they started, on the last night before the unknown, in a small Andalusian harbour that smelled like fish and tar and fear. Let's talk about the ships themselves, because until you understand how small they were, how exposed, how absurdly fragile for what they were about to attempt, you can't really grasp what crossing the Atlantic in 1492 actually meant. There were 3 of them. The Santa María, the flagship, was a carrack, what the Spanish called a nau, a small merchant vessel, probably around 100 to 110 tons burden, with an estimated hull length of about 19 metres. To give you some perspective, that's roughly the length of a modern school bus, or maybe 4 sedan cars parked end to end. The entire ship, bow to stern, would fit comfortably inside a modest 2-bedroom apartment, and this was the big one. The other 2 were caravels, smaller and lighter. The Niña, probably 50 to 60 tons, with a deck length around 15 metres, about the size of a 40-foot sailboat you might see moored at a marina today. The Pinta was slightly larger, maybe 60 to 70 tons, 17 metres on deck. If you stood at the bow and looked back toward the stern, you could probably throw a stone and hit the tiller. These weren't ships in the way we imagine ships. They were tiny wooden platforms, barely larger than the pleasure yachts wealthy people sail around the Mediterranean on vacation, except they were about to carry 90 men across an unknown ocean for weeks, with no resupply, no rescue, and no way home except back the way they came. Now, we need to pause here and admit something. These numbers, these dimensions, they're educated guesses. The original plans for all three ships are long gone, if they ever existed in any formal sense. What we have are later descriptions, comparisons to similar vessels, archaeological finds of shipwrecks from the same period, and a lot of careful historical reconstruction. So when you hear someone say the Santa Maria was exactly 108 tons or precisely 18.9 meters long, take it with a grain of salt. Different scholars, different museums, different reconstructions give slightly different figures, but the overall picture is clear. These ships were shockingly, almost unbelievably small. The layout varied depending on the type. The Santa Maria, being a carrack, had a raised forecastle at the bow and a taller stern castle at the stern. 3 masts, the fore and main rigged with big square sails, the mizzen carrying a triangular lateen sail, plus a small square sail on the bowsprit. The result was a compact multi-level structure, part cargo hauler, part floating fortress, with a few small cabins tucked into the stern castle for officers, and a cramped hold below the main deck for provisions, water casks, trade goods, spare canvas, coiled rope, and whatever else they thought they might need on the other side of the world. The caravels were different. Lower, sleeker, more open. They had a relatively flush main deck with only small raised platforms fore and aft. In this period they often carried a mix of square and lateen sails, a rig the Spanish called caravella redonda, which made them faster, more manoeuvrable, better suited to exploring unknown coasts. But that openness came at a cost. There was almost no enclosed space below deck. Most of the ordinary sailors, the men who actually worked the ship, lived, ate, and slept on the open main deck in all weather. No cabins, no bunks, no privacy. Just a square of damp planking and whatever piece of canvas or wool blanket you could claim as your own. Stand on the deck of one of these caravels at anchor, and you'd feel the hull moving beneath you, the gentle rise and fall of the tide, the creak and groan of wood flexing against rope and iron fastenings. Even tied up safe in harbour, the ship never stopped talking, timbers rubbing together, rigging snapping taut and going slack, the smell of fresh tar and oakum caulking, thick and sticky, coating the seams to keep the ocean out, the rough grain of hand-hewn planking underfoot, uneven, splintered in places, still bearing the marks of the adze that shaped it. These were living things, these ships, organic, flexible, always moving, always making noise, and very, very small. Now imagine filling those tiny wooden worlds with 90 men. 90 human beings, each with their own fears, their own reasons for being there, crammed together for weeks with nowhere to go and no way out, except forward into the unknown or backward across the same terrifying emptiness they'd just crossed. They weren't a random collection of dreamers and desperados, though later stories sometimes paint them that way. Most were experienced Andalusian seamen, men from the coastal towns clustered around the mouth of the Rio Tinto, Palos, Moguer, Huelva, places where the ocean wasn't an abstraction or an adventure, it was work. These were fishing communities, trading ports, towns where boys grew up on boats and men earned their living hauling nets or piloting cargo vessels down the African coast. They knew wind and tide. They knew how to read weather in the colour of the sky at dawn. They knew when to reef a sail and when to ride out a blow. What they didn't know, what nobody knew, was whether the ocean sea had an end or whether sailing west would just carry them past the edge of the world into some biblical abyss. But they went anyway. Partly because of the 2 men who convinced them it might actually work. The Pinzon brothers, Martin Alonso and Vicente Yañez. If Columbus was the ambition behind the voyage, the foreign visionary with royal backing and unshakable conviction, the Pinzons were the credibility. Martin Alonso was already a respected figure in Palos, a ship owner, a navigator, someone who'd made money on Atlantic ventures and knew how to keep a crew alive when things went wrong. He captained the Pinta. Vicente Yanez, younger but equally capable, took command of the Niña. According to later testimony, fragments preserved in legal disputes decades after the voyage, Martín Alonso personally walked the docks and taverns of Palos, Moguer and Huelva, recruiting men, not ordering them, convincing them. He spoke their language. He was one of them. And when he said this, Genoese foreigners' plan might actually reach the Indies. When he put his own ships and his own reputation on the line, men listened. The Pinzon name carried weight. It still does in that corner of Spain, where streets and plazas bear their name, and the family's role in making the impossible voyage possible is remembered as clearly as Columbus's. The Pinzons brought more than credibility. They brought specialists. Every ship needed certain skills represented, certain roles filled, or it wouldn't survive a month at sea. There was a carpenter, someone who could repair split timbers, fashion a new spar if one cracked in a storm, keep the vessel structurally sound when the nearest shipyard was weeks or months away. A caulker, whose job was to constantly inspect the seams between planks, pressing oakum and tar into gaps where seawater tried to seep through, because a ship that stops being watertight stops being a ship and becomes a coffin. Pilots, men trained in navigation, who could work a compass, estimate latitude with an astrolabe or quadrant, keep track of the ship's position by dead reckoning when there were no landmarks and the stars were the only reference points. There was also an interpreter, Luis de Torres, a converso from Moguer, a man of Jewish heritage who had converted to Christianity but retained a gift for languages. He spoke Hebrew, some Aramaic, Arabic, and of course Castilian. Columbus had chosen him specifically, expecting to meet Muslim merchants, Jewish traders, maybe even emissaries of the Great Khan when they reached the eastern shores of Asia. It's strange to think about now, knowing what we know, but Columbus genuinely believed he'd need someone who could negotiate in Arabic or Hebrew when they landed. Instead, de Torres would be sent inland on Cuba in early November, searching for palaces and finding villages, witnessing indigenous people rolling and smoking dried leaves in a practice Europeans had never seen. Tobacco. The first recorded European encounter with it, all because an interpreter with no relevant languages was the closest thing they had to a diplomat. There were also men whose presence reminds us this wasn't just an adventure. It was a business venture, a royal investment. A vida, an inspector or comptroller, sailed with the fleet, tasked with keeping records, safeguarding any gold or valuables discovered, making sure the crown got its share. Notaries, men trained to write legally binding documents. Columbus was an explorer, but he was also expected to come back with proof, with accounts that could be audited and taxed. The apparatus of empire was already aboard before a single piece of new land had been claimed. And then there were the others, the ordinary seamen, able-bodied sailors whose names we mostly don't know. Men who trimmed sails, hauled lines, stood watch through the night, scraped barnacles, pumped bilge water, coiled rope until their hands bled. Young men, some of them, ship's boys, grumettes, teenagers from poor families for whom a few months' wages and the slim chance of fortune was worth the terror. They did the hardest labour, slept in the worst spots, ate last, and had no say in where the ship went or whether it turned back. A handful of convicts sailed too. Men offered commuted sentences if they agreed to join the voyage. We don't know exactly how many or what their crimes were, but the fact that the Crown was willing to empty cells to fill ships tells you something about how difficult recruitment must have been. Imagine being one of those men, locked up, facing years in a Spanish prison or worse, and then someone offers you a choice. Stay and rot, or sail off the edge of the map with a Genoese dreamer who thinks he can reach Asia by going the wrong direction. Some took the deal, maybe out of desperation, maybe because even an unknown ocean seemed better than a known cell, maybe because despite everything, they still had hope. The kind of hope that keeps you moving when logic says stop. And above them all, directing, obsessing, calculating, stood Columbus himself, a foreigner, a Genoese mariner in Castilian service, funded by Ferdinand and Isabella, but commanding Spanish sailors who didn't entirely trust him. He spoke Castilian with an accent. He wore his conviction like armour, but beneath it, he must have known how precarious his position was. He needed the pinzons. He needed the ordinary seamen to obey orders even when fear told them to mutiny. He needed the pilots to trust his reckoning even when the distances didn't match and the landmarks never appeared. He was brilliant, relentless, probably insufferable, and he had no idea what he was about to find. None of them did. 90 men divided across 3 tiny ships, each carrying their own reasons, their own fears, experienced sailors and desperate convicts, local heroes and a foreign commander, boys barely old enough to shave and men old enough to know better, all of them about to sail past the last familiar shore and into a future none of them could imagine. They left before dawn, August 3rd, 1492, pre-dawn darkness still clinging to the streets of Palos when the men began moving toward the waterfront. According to later tradition, they'd gathered first at the church of San Jorge, the small parish church that stood on higher ground overlooking the harbour. Mass, final prayers. The priest's voice echoing off stone walls while 90 men knelt in the shadows, some devout, some just going through the motions, all of them acutely aware this might be the last time they heard those familiar Latin words in a familiar place. Then they walked down. Through the old stone archway they later called the Puerta de los Novios, the gate of the newlyweds, though that name came later, layered with meanings these men couldn't have known. Down through narrow streets where families waited, wives, mothers, children too young to understand why their fathers were leaving. The quay was crowded, torchlight reflecting off dark water, the 3 ships already rigged and provisioned, hulls creaking against their moorings as the tide began to shift. There must have been weeping. There must have been men who stood at the rail as the lines were cast off and looked back at faces they would, in some cases, never see again. This wasn't an afternoon fishing trip. This wasn't a coast-hugging trade run to Lisbon or Cadiz. This was sailing west until you found the Indies or until you died trying. Everyone on that quay understood the stakes, even if they couldn't articulate them. Columbus had royal backing, impressive credentials, the Pinzon brothers lending their weight to the enterprise. None of it changed the fact that they were sailing toward a horizon no European had ever returned from. The ships caught the morning tide and the river current carried them down the Rio Tinto, past mudflats and marshes, past the last curves where Palos and Moguer disappeared behind low hills. By midday they were in open coastal waters. By evening the Spanish shore was a dark line behind them, and ahead lay the first leg of the journey, the only part that felt remotely safe, the run south to the Canary Islands. For Andalusian sailors this was familiar territory, standard procedure. Ships bound for West Africa routinely stopped at the Canaries for provisions, for repairs, for favourable winds. The islands were Spanish possessions, outposts of the known world scattered across the eastern Atlantic like stepping stones leading toward emptiness. Columbus had planned this from the start. You didn't just point your bow west from Spain and sail into the unknown. You dropped south first. You staged. You waited for the right conditions. You let your crew have one last taste of solid ground before the real crossing began. But even this familiar leg had its complications. Somewhere off the Andalusian coast, the Pinta developed trouble, her rudder. According to the accounts preserved by Las Casas, summarizing Columbus's lost journal, the rudder became loose or damaged, possibly deliberately, though Columbus suspected sabotage by the ship's owner, who'd been coerced into lending the vessel, and might have wanted an excuse to turn back. Whatever the cause, the Pinta was limping. They couldn't cross an ocean with a ship that couldn't steer properly. So the plan shifted. Get to the Canaries. fix the problem there, then proceed. They reached Gran Canaria first, then La Gomera, the westernmost island with a decent harbour. The fleet spent nearly a month among the Canaries, longer than Columbus wanted but necessary. The Pinta's rudder was repaired, strengthened, made seaworthy again, but more significantly they made a major technical change to the Niña. She'd been rigged with lateen sails, the triangular sails typical of Mediterranean caravels, perfect for coastal work and tacking into the wind but less efficient for long-distance running before steady winds. At La Gomera they re-rigged her, took down the lateen yards and replaced them with square sails, transatlantic sails, sails designed to catch a following wind and hold it for weeks at a time without constant adjustment. It was a clear signal. This wasn't exploration anymore. This was commitment. Square sails meant they expected to run west for a very long time before turning back. It meant Columbus believed the trade winds would carry them straight across to Asia. It meant the point of no return was approaching fast. While the carpenters and riggers worked, other men brought provisions aboard, casks of fresh water, hoisted from the wells of La Gomera, and stowed in the holds where they'd slosh and leak and grow brackish over the coming weeks. Firewood, bundled and tied down, salted meat, hardtack, wine, cheese, everything they'd need, because once they left these islands there would be no resupply until they reached land again, wherever and whenever that might be. You can imagine the mood. The Canaries were Spanish. There were people here, settlements, churches, women speaking Castilian, taverns where you could get drunk and pretend you weren't about to sail off the edge of every map ever drawn. Some of the men must have been tempted to stay, to find an excuse, an injury, a sudden attack of common sense. But they didn't. Maybe because the Pinzons held them together. Maybe because they'd already come this far, and turning back felt worse than going forward. Maybe because standing on La Gomera and looking west, the ocean didn't look that different from the ocean they'd already crossed. It was still just water, still just wind. The terror was abstract, distant, easy to ignore when the sun was shining and the ships were sound and the wine was decent. Then came September 6th, 1492, Thursday. Columbus gave the order. The last provisions were aboard. The repairs were finished. The winds were steady from the northeast, exactly what they needed. They weighed anchor and stood out from La Gomera, the volcanic peak of the island dark against the morning sky, and they turned their bows west, due west, into the ocean sea, into the part of the world marked on medieval maps with warnings and monsters, and the simple admission that no one really knew what was out there. According to later narratives based on Columbus's journal, filtered through Las Casas and other sources, the men watched the Canaries shrink behind them with something approaching dread. The black silhouettes of El Hierro and La Gomera, the westernmost specks of the known world, growing smaller, fading into the haze and then gone. Just ocean, just horizon in every direction. Blue deepening to something darker, something vast and indifferent. And the wind, the steady northeast trades, filling the sails and pushing them forward day after day with no sign of stopping. Some of the sailors reportedly wept. Some believed openly that they would never see Spain again, that they were sailing toward death, following a foreigner's delusion because they had been too proud or too desperate to say no. The psychological threshold had been crossed. The last familiar shore had disappeared behind them. Ahead lay 5 weeks of empty ocean and the most improbable discovery in human history. But they didn't know that yet. All they knew was the wind and the sails and the unbroken line where the sky met the sea. Once the Canaries were gone and there was nothing left but water, the voyage stopped feeling like an event and started feeling like a routine. Human beings can get used to almost anything, and the men on the Niña, Pinta, and Santa María did what sailors always do. They built a day out of fragments of work and habit. They wrapped themselves in pattern so the enormity of what they were doing didn't crush them. The pattern began with time, not with clocks because there were none, but with sand. Somewhere near the mainmast, lashed where spray would not easily knock it free, hung the half-hour glass, the ampoletta, a simple bulb of glass with sand running from one chamber to the other. One of the lowest-ranking boys on board, on each ship there would have been at least one, was given a job that never really ended. Every 30 minutes, day and night, he turned that glass. You can picture him, barefoot on damp planks, eyes heavy from too little sleep, waiting as the sand thinned into a final trickle, a few grains clinging, then letting go. He flips the glass, calls out, and somewhere a bell or a shouted count marks the passage. 1 glass, 2, up to 8 for the end of a 4-hour watch. Then it begins again. The men's lives were divided by those turns of sand. 2 watches, alternating, one on duty while the other tried to eat, to rest, to patch clothes and fraying nerves. 6 watches in every 24 hours, most of them indistinguishable from the last. Dark, light, dark again. Wind from the same quarter. The ocean swell heaving beneath the hull with the same slow, indifferent rhythm. Just before dawn, when the horizon is only a slightly less dense shade of black, the routine shifts. A boy's voice rises thinly over the creak of timbers and the slap of waves. Maybe it's a simple prayer to the Virgin, or one of the little rhyming ditties sailors used to mark the changing watch. Reports based on later seafaring practice suggest something like, "That would have been common. A sung signal that night is ending, that the next 4-hour slice of labour is about to begin." Men stir under damp cloaks, on the open decks of the Niña and Pinta, where most of the ordinary sailors lived their entire lives for those weeks. There are no cosy cabins, no private bunks, just whatever spot you've claimed near a coil of rope or a raised bit of deck that keeps you slightly out of the run of water. Limbs are stiff, clothes are salt stiff too, never quite dry. Someone coughs, someone else mutters a half-remembered fragment of the morning office. The off-going watch hands over. The men who've spent the night trimming sails and watching the compass pass responsibilities to their shipmates. The new watch checks the lines. Fingers work over hemp, feeling for stiffness or hidden rot. They look up into the pale outline of canvas against the brightening sky, judging the set of each sail. The helmsman, if he's careful, will have a word with his replacement. The course, the feel of the rudder, any oddness in the swell. This isn't written anywhere. It's the quiet inheritance of practical seamanship. Then comes cleaning. However tired, however far from land, there are decks to be swabbed. On a tiny caravel, filth is more than unpleasant. It's dangerous. Rot, disease, slippery planks when the ship heels suddenly. So men take buckets, dip them over the side and toss cold Atlantic water across the timbers. Bare feet slap through it. Brushes and bundles of rags scrape and scrub. The smell of salt and tar, of old fish and stale wine lifts into the morning air. Ropes get coiled properly, blocks are checked. A frayed shroud might be the difference between a man dying in the rigging and a man coming down safe in the next squall. Somewhere aft, near the compass, Columbus or one of his pilots is already looking at the needle. Navigation, in theory, was the most sophisticated thing happening on those cramped decks. In practice, it was a mixture of experience and guesswork. Columbus had an educated sense of where he believed Asia should be, distances calculated from books and charts. But keeping track of where he actually was on any given dawn depended on simple things. The heading on the compass, the time marked by that half-hour glass, and a feel for the ship's speed. There was no standardized logline yet, no neat system of knots paid out and counted. Instead, they watched the water, foam and weed sliding past the hull, the way the bow rose and fell, a pilot might estimate 3 miles in an hour, or 4, maybe 5 on a good run. Added up glass by glass, watch by watch, and you have dead reckoning. Drawn as a faint, hopeful line on a mental map in a world where the only land ahead is theoretical. When the sun climbed toward its highest point, the rhythm broke briefly for another kind of measurement. On clear days, according to later reconstructions of Columbus's methods, he or his pilot would sometimes bring out the quadrant or astrolabe. These were not precision instruments in untrained hands, and the deck of a small ship in the Atlantic is not a steady platform. Still, there would be a ritual to it. A few men gather, shading their eyes. The navigator lifts the instrument, tries to catch the sun at its noon height. Shadows waver, the ship rolls, a wave passes, and the angle is read as best it can be. Many of Columbus's recorded latitude attempts were wildly off, if later historians have interpreted them correctly. But the act itself mattered. It marked the day's peak. A moment of concentrated, almost ceremonial attention in the middle of endless water. Between these fixed points, the dawn prayer, the noon sight, the evening change of watch, lay the real weight of the voyage, work. Relentless, repetitive, physical work. Lines had to be hauled. On the square-rigged Santa María and the re-rigged Niña, the trade winds from the northeast filled the broad canvas, driving the ship steadily west. But even in steady winds, sails stretch, chafe, and need trimming. Men heaved on braces to swing yards a few degrees. They eased sheets, took them in again. A voice called the cadence, back strained, hands burned. The rope bit deep into calloused palms. Other men climbed, up the ratlines into the rigging, the ship swaying beneath them. There is no safety harness, just fingers and toes, and a lifelong familiarity with the sea's motion. Up there the world widens, an endless circle of blue, the faint curve of earth suggested by how the horizon aches away. But the man aloft is not there for the view. He is there to loose or furl a sail, to check for a tear along a seam, to make sure a line is not sawing itself in two on a rough spar. Down below, near the bilge, another labour goes on that almost never stops. These were not watertight hulls by modern standards. Planking shrinks, seams open, waves force themselves into every gap. So, watch after watch, men take turns at the pumps, working handles up and down, lifting the cold, sour water that accumulates in the ship's lowest spaces and sending it back over the side. The rhythm of the pump becomes part of the ship's own heartbeat. Creak, splash, sigh, over and over. Between such tasks, anything that could be fixed was. A frayed rope is unlaid, its damaged strands cut out, spliced back. Canvas with a small tear is stitched before the next gale can rip it into uselessness. The carpenter checks the mast's partners and wedges. The caulker listens for ominous working in the hull. There is always something that can break. The only question is whether you spot it in time. And when a man's watch ended, when he was one of the lucky ones off duty for a few hours, what then? Not rest, not entirely. The ship is too small for that, too alive. He might sit with his back against a warm plank, needle in hand, patching the same shirt for the third time. The cloth is rough, stiff with salt. Each stitch must be forced through. He might trim a bit of spare wood into a crude carving, a saint's face, a knife handle, anything to give his hand something to do that isn't hauling. Dice appear, little cubes rattling against the deck, fortunes changing with each toss. A few extra bites of something more palatable, a swig of someone else's wine. Stories pass back and forth, tales of other voyages, of Lisbon and Guinea and the Atlantic islands. Rumours, too, about what might lie ahead. Islands thick with spice trees or sea monsters, or storms that never end. Some men sing. The old sea songs are half prayer, half entertainment, versus improvised call and response drifting out over the water. Monotony presses in, thick as the heat on still days. The mind circles back to the same question: how far and for how long? As the sun sinks and the sky turns from blue to a deepening violet, the pattern narrows again. Evening. The end of another day measured in glasses of sand and miles guessed. The watch changes once more. Orders are given quietly. Sails are snugged down a little for the night. Fewer men aloft. More attention to the compass, to the feel of the helm. Night sailing is not a different art, but the consequences of a mistake feel closer in the dark. Then the stars come out. Far from any shore, with no lamps but a few shielded lanterns on each tiny ship, the sky is overwhelming. Men used to the dim, smoky light of houses and taverns see the Milky Way as a bright, cloud-like river overhead. Familiar constellations guide them, always Polaris steady to the north, but around them are countless other points of light, unnamed, silent. Some of the officers, Columbus among them, are said to have watched the heavens closely, noting variations, trying to relate them to their changing latitude. For most of the crew, the stars were less an instrument and more a presence, a kind of immense ceiling arching over the fragile planks they trusted with their lives. The sounds shift at night, fewer voices. The slap of waves against the hull grows louder when no one is shouting orders. The wind in the rigging becomes a continuous low roar. Somewhere forward, a man on lookout calls out now and then, more from duty than expectation. There's nothing to see but water and sky, no lights, no land, just the small, constant noises of wood and rope and human breathing. The boy with the glass is still awake. Sand runs, glass turns, another half-hour gone, another small unit of courage measured out. On these 3 little ships in 1492, this was how time moved. Not in days on a calendar, not in great discoveries or crises, but in the slow accumulation of ordinary moments, work and fatigue, prayer and boredom, the ceaseless rhythm of the sea and the equally ceaseless rhythm of men adapting themselves to it, one watch at a time. In the middle of that pattern of work and watches, there had to be something to hold a man's body together. Rope and canvas, muscle and bone, all of it runs on food, even if, out here, food was a generous word. Before any of this, before the endless glasses of sand, there had been a moment on solid ground, in the little port of Palos, when the future of the voyage looked like stacks and barrels and bales. You can imagine the quay crowded with them, great casks of water, dark-hooped and sweating in the heat, barrels of rough red wine, sacks of unmilled wheat and coarse flour, piles of biscuit, bizcocho, what later ages would simply call hardtack, slabs of salted pork and beef, packed in crystals of salt so heavy they glittered, bundles of dried and salted cod, baskets of chickpeas and lentils, a little rice, amphorae of olive oil, jars of vinegar, wheels of hard cheese, small sacks of almonds, sticky pots of honey, wrinkled raisins clinging to their stalks. Not a feast exactly, but a promise that for some number of weeks there would be something to put in a man's stomach. At Palos they loaded what they could, according to the provisioning habits of the time. Historians, working from later lists and comparable fleets, think the bulk of the rations would have been biscuit and salt meat, with legumes and a little oil and wine to soften the edges. Then, at the Canary Islands, the last real pause before the leap into empty ocean, the ships took on more. Fresh water to top off the casks, additional biscuit baked under a hotter sun, perhaps more dried fish and local produce, whatever could stand some weeks at sea. Once the islands had slipped under the horizon behind them, that stored abundance began its slow, inevitable decline. On board, the raw ingredients were only half the story. The other half was what you could actually do with them on a rolling bucking deck. Spanish ships of this period did not have cosy galleys tucked below, with chimneys and iron stoves. They had a box, a simple, sand-filled firebox, the fogon, lashed somewhere on the open deck where it was least likely to set the ship on fire, a place where, when the weather allowed, a cook or an unlucky sailor could coax coals into life and set a couple of heavy pots to boil. Most meals, when the sea was kind, were some variation of the same thing, a one-pot stew or porridge, salted pork or beef soaked and boiled long enough to drag some of the brine back out of it, chickpeas, lentils or beans simmered until they split, a handful of rice perhaps to thicken the mass, a trickle of olive oil, a splash of vinegar, garlic, if any remained, chopped in to lend bite. Sometimes instead of meat, it was dried cod, rehydrated and stewed until its fibres yielded. You can picture the pot, blackened from use, hanging from an iron hook. Steam rising, fragrant more from hunger than from any real spice. Men queuing with their wooden bowls or shared trenchers, waiting their turn as the ladle dips and lifts. No separate plates, no orderly dining room, just small knots of men, messes of 3, 4, 5, settling cross-legged on the planks, backs against the bulwarks or coils of rope, sharing from a common portion. The sea heaves and the stew sloshes. Someone curses softly as a bit of precious liquid spills. Someone else laughs, because what else can you do? On days when the wind rose and the ship pitched hard, it was different. Fire and open deck do not mix well in a gale. When spray swept the planks and the fogon had to be doused, the men made do with what needed no flame. Then the meal might be only biscuit and cheese, or biscuit and a strip of dried fish. The biscuit was the constant bizcocho. It had been baked and baked again in shore ovens until almost all moisture was driven out. That made it keep if you kept it somewhat dry. It also made it hard enough to break teeth. To eat it, a man might slam it against the rail to fracture it. He might use the butt of his knife as a hammer. Often he would soften it in something. A dip in the day's ration of wine, a dunk in water, a crumble into the hot stew when there was any, letting it swell and lose its edges. At the beginning of the voyage, the biscuit would have been merely tough. As the weeks passed, something else moved in. Weevils, little beetles whose eggs waited dormant in flour and came to life in the warm, slightly damp dark of a casket sea. Later sailors would talk about maggots and worms in their bread, about biscuits that seemed to crawl. There is no reason to think 1492 was different. Men learned old tricks, eating in the dark so their eyes would not confirm what their tongues suspected, breaking the biscuit into their bowl, pouring stew or wine over it, waiting a moment, then skimming off what floated to the surface. Protein, if you wanted to be philosophical. A test of will, if you did not. The meat too changed. Salted beef and pork could last a long time in good casks, but good was a relative term on a small wet ship. Wood swelled and shrank. Brine leaked. Fat went rancid. A piece of meat pulled from the barrel in the 4th week was not the same as one from the 1st. It would come out grey, tough, smelling strongly of salt and something just on the edge of decay. Soak it, boil it again. You're not trying to make it delicious, you're trying to make it edible. The broth, thick and greasy, became part of the stew. The men ate what they could, threw the most offensive bits to the sea and kept chewing. Water too betrayed them. In theory, each cask left shore clear and fresh. In practice, wood is porous. Organisms live in water. In the heat of the tropics left standing for weeks, what had been clean became green. A sour scum might form. The smell could be enough to turn a stomach already uneasy from motion and monotony. They drank it anyway when they had to. Wine at least held its own better. It might sour, edging toward vinegar, but it did not rot in the same way. And there was a lot of it. Spanish military rations from a few decades later suggest something like a litre of wine per man per day was considered normal, and it would not be surprising if Columbus's provisioning followed a similar logic. Wine on these ships wasn't a luxury. It was a staple, a measure of safety, often less contaminated than the water, a source of calories, above all, a comfort. Imagine the end of a watch, arms aching, clothes clammy. A man comes to his messmates, takes his share from a common jug or ladle. The wine is rough, maybe half vinegar by now, but it is warm in a way that little else on board can be. He feels it go down, a thin line of heat against the salt and cold. For a moment, the world narrows to that, to the company of the men around him and the sense that, at least for this glass, there is still something pleasant left. Calorically, that rough balance of biscuit, salt meat or fish, legumes, cheese, oil and wine probably served its purpose. Later ration scales suggest that an ordinary sailor might get hundreds of grams of bread a day, a substantial chunk of protein, and that daily wine. Enough to power hauling lines and climbing rigging, at least in the short term. What it did not provide was freshness. No citrus, no leafy greens. Perhaps a little onion or garlic, a handful of dried fruit or nuts shared out on special days, a smear of honey. But as the weeks from Palos lengthened and the brief abundance of the Canaries faded in memory, everything on the table was either dried, salted, or both. Modern medicine tells us that scurvy, the slow collapse of a body starved of vitamin C, usually takes more than a month or two to bloom in full horror. Columbus's westward crossing from the Canaries to his first landfall ran for roughly 5 weeks. That is probably not long enough for gums to rot and teeth to fall out in great numbers. But fatigue, irritability, small changes in the skin, these might have crept in. Hard to distinguish from simple exhaustion. From too little sleep and the nagging ache of constant labour. And yet, even in its monotony, even in its slow decay, the act of eating together mattered. Picture a midday on the open deck of the Niña or the Pinta, the sun high, sails full, the ship lifting and settling on the swell. Work pauses just enough for the stew pot to make its round. Men from the same region, the same family, or simply thrown together by chance gather in small circles. One man dips the ladle, another breaks the biscuit. They pass the bowl hand to hand, each taking a scoop, careful and practised. Talk is quieter now, mouths too busy for argument. Someone mentions home, bread fresh from an oven, olives from a particular tree, wine that doesn't taste of tar and distance. Someone else, not wanting to dwell on absences, steers the talk back to the sea, the colour of the water that morning, the peculiar way weed drifted past the bow. No one eats alone, not if it can be helped. There is no privacy, and there is no excess. What you have, you see. What your companions have, you share. If a man has saved a few almonds, a cluster of raisins, a spoon of honey, they may appear now, divided among the mess. Tiny bursts of sweetness and oil that can linger in memory for days. These shared meals, whether hot stew by a smoking fogon or cold biscuit gnawed in the dark, did something more than fill bellies. They mark the day the way the glass and the bell mark the hours. Morning ration, midday meal, evening wine, regular islands of predictability in a world where the horizon never changed. Even as the biscuit went soft with unseen life, even as the water turned and the meat lost all resemblance to anything that had walked on land, those rituals of eating and drinking stitched the crew together. A man might doubt the course, he might fear the emptiness ahead, but he knew that when the watch ended there would be a pot, a bowl, a crust, and the same faces around him. In the middle of the unknown ocean sea, that too was a kind of hope. Eating together gave the day its landmarks, but everything in between was filled with something else. A constant immersion, a world that wrapped itself around your body and never let go. If you had been there, the first thing you might remember would not be what you saw, but what you heard. Sound came first. On a small wooden ship in the late 15th century, silence didn't really exist. Even when men stopped talking, the vessel itself kept speaking. There was the wind, always the wind. When it was light, it hummed through the rigging, a low, steady tone as it slid past rope and spar. When it freshened, that hum broke into a chorus, the rattle of blocks, the high whine of taut lines, the occasional sharp crack as a loose rope end snapped against wood. Canvas had its own language. In a gentle breeze the sails bellied and sighed, full and content. In squalls or sudden shifts of direction they flogged. Loud, violent reports like whips or distant gunshots as heavy cloth slammed and filled and slammed again. Men learned, quickly, to read those sounds with their ears, long before any order was shouted. Beneath and around you, the hull never stopped answering the sea. Every time a swell lifted the ship, the timbers flexed. Not enough to see usually, but enough to hear. A chorus of groans and creaks, joints working, planks rubbing, pegs and tree nails shifting minutely in their holes. New wood, still green from the shipyard, made one kind of sound. Older, seasoned beams, strained by years of work, made another, deeper, more tired, as if the ship herself were an old animal, still strong but aware of every bone. The sea struck its own rhythm. The slap and suck of waves along the planking, the hollow thud when a larger swell hit just right and the bow dropped into a trough. At times, especially in lighter winds, you could hear water sliding past the hull in a continuous murmur, a rushing whisper that reminded you, whether you wanted reminding or not, that there was only a few centimetres of oak between your feet, and depths no one aboard could truly imagine. Layered on top of this were human sounds, the clatter of bare feet or worn shoes on the deck, the thump of coils of rope dropped into place, the scrape of a knife on wood as someone carved idly during a brief rest, soft conversations in Andalusian Spanish, sometimes in dialects thick enough that men from other regions had to learn each other's voices as much as their words. Every 4 hours, the turning of the watch added its own ritual noise. The sand in the glass run out. The bell struck, 1, 2, up to 8 times as the watch progressed. A boy's voice, perhaps 12, 13 years old, calling out the time or the change, high and clear over the deeper murmur of adult speech. At night, that same voice might sing out a simple chant to keep himself awake, answered by a sleepy joke from somewhere in the dark. Prayers wove through it all. Morning and evening, according to later summaries, Columbus called the men together for communal devotions. You can imagine the murmur of the Pater Noster and the Ave Maria rising and falling with the swell, some voices fervent, some automatic, all of them threaded into the sound of the ship and sea. On certain days, when the weather had been kind or a particular danger past, they might add a vow to Our Lady or to a favourite saint, promising candles or a pilgrimage if only they reached land again. Even when words faded, the ship never did. At 3 in the morning, with most of the crew asleep and the stars sharp overhead, the Santa María or the Niña still crackled and sighed and groaned as if in conversation with the ocean. Men who spent their lives afloat talked about listening to their ships, about knowing from a change in pitch or rhythm when something was wrong long before they saw it. If sound was the constant companion, smell was the inescapable background. At first, leaving Palos, it might not have seemed so bad. Tar and pitch dominated. The thick, resinous odour from where seams had been newly caulked, where rigging had been slathered to keep out rot and water. Fresh-cut wood still held a faint sweetness. Salt air flowed cleanly over the deck, carrying the occasional whiff of smoke from the fourgon. That didn't last. dampness seeped into everything. These ships were small, crowded, and low to the water. Spray blew over the bow, ran down the scuppers, soaked clothes and rope and crates. Below, where the cargo lay, barrels of provisions, coils of spare rope, maybe some trade goods. The air was thick and close. There was the bilge, that hidden lowest space where seawater, spilled wine, leaked brine, and all the drips and droppings of shipboard life collected. No one in 1492 had pumps or cleaning routines that would satisfy a modern inspector. Men knew they needed to keep the bilge from filling too high. They worked the pumps when ordered, but they also knew that something down there always stank. A sour, mouldy, rotting smell that rose through cracks and hatches, especially in heat and calm weather, like the breath of the ocean's stomach. Add to that the smell of bodies. 90 men, give or take, across the 3 vessels, sweat from hard labour under a tropical sun, clothes that rarely, if ever, saw fresh water. Washing, when it happened, was with seawater hauled up in buckets, bracing, a little sticky as it dried, and practical only when there was time. No separate washrooms, no place to undress in private. Men slept in the same clothes they worked in. Lice and fleas were probably common travellers. The odour of unwashed wool and linen, of skin and hair and breath, lodged in every crevice. Food added its notes. The smoke of the cooking fire was a comfort, but it also clung. So did the scent of boiling salt meat and fish, dense, fatty, sometimes edging toward rancid. When a barrel turned, when a piece of meat came out questionable and had to be scraped or trimmed, the smell could send a wave of muttered complaint along the deck. And then there were the animals. According to typical practice, at least early in the voyage, there may have been some live livestock aboard. A few hens for eggs, maybe a pig or 2 intended for slaughter later on, perhaps even a goat. Each animal came with its own musk, its own waste. Their pens had to be mucked out somewhere in the middle of this floating village. Sanitation was simple and exposed. For the ordinary sailor, the toilet was a board or seat set out over the rail near the bow, the precursor of what later English speakers would call the head. No walls, no door, just a man, his balance, the wind, and the awareness that anyone walking by could see him. In heavy seas, using it was an act of both necessity and faith. What missed the ocean stayed on the hull until the next wave found it. What stayed on deck until someone had time to swill it away contributed to the ever-present tang of ammonia and waste. All of that, tar, pitch, bilge, sweat, smoke, animals, latrine, blended into a smell that men who lived on ships learned to stop noticing most of the time. But if you came fresh from land, or if you had somehow stepped away in your imagination, you might catch it all at once and feel, briefly, as if the whole world were made of salt and rot and life pressed too close together. Against this there was touch, the feel of the ship under and against you. Motion was the rule. Always. Even in calm weather, the Atlantic swell rolled the caravels and the Santa Maria in a slow, deliberate rhythm. The ship rose, paused, and sank. Rolled left, came back to centre, rolled right, yelled gently as the rudder bit and released. Your feet never quite forgot that the planks beneath them could tilt without warning. Men learned to widen their stance, to keep a hand free when they could, to move with the ship rather than fight it. Newcomers misjudged a roll, staggered, reached for a rope or a friend's arm. Old hands adjusted half unconsciously, bodies remembering what minds no longer needed to think about. In heavier weather, that motion turned violent. The deck would lurch, rising suddenly under your boots as a wave lifted the bow, then dropping hard enough to make your stomach float as the ship slammed into the next trough. Sleeping or waking, the sea never stopped reminding you that you were a small, fragile thing perched on a wooden shell. Salt worked its way into your skin. Spray blew across the deck. Tiny droplets carried on every gust. Clothes grew stiff as they dried. crusted with fine white crystals that scratched when you moved. Hair tangled and grew briny, lips cracked. For days at a time, everything you touched felt either wet, crusted with salt, or both. The ropes were hemp, rough and fibrous. Hauling on them, hour after hour, raised blisters on soft hands and deepened calluses on hard ones. Tar from the rigging got under your fingernails, streaked your palms, smeared across your woolen sleeves. The wood of the rail and mast was smoother where hundreds of hands had gripped it, polished by sweat and pressure, but it could still splinter if you grabbed carelessly in a sudden roll. Sleep did not mean escape from these sensations. In 1492, European ships had not yet adopted hammocks. Those would come later, after Columbus and his men saw the cotton, beds-like nets used by the indigenous people of the Caribbean, and sailors realized that a body suspended from hooks did not roll quite as hard with the sea. For this crossing, there were no such comforts. Ordinary seamen slept where there was space. On the open deck, if the weather allowed, curled against a coil of rope, tucked under an overhanging boat or the shadow of the forecastle, wrapped in a coarse blanket that was never quite dry. Below, in cramped corners amid cargo and spare gear, on bare planks that echoed every creak of the hull. There were no neat rows of bunks, no mattresses. A cloak folded twice might serve as a pillow. A sea chest, if a man was lucky enough to have one, could be one side of his world, a wall between him and the elbow of a messmate. On calm, clear nights, you might stretch out under the open sky, feeling the faint spray drift over your face, the boards hard under your shoulder blades, the roll of the ship rocking you as if in a rough cradle. On wet nights, sleep became a series of brief dozes snatched between gusts and orders, your body always half awake, ready to scramble up if a shout sent everyone to the braces. Privacy in all of this was more an idea than a reality. You changed clothes, when you changed them at all, in full view. You relieved yourself in sight of others. You dreamed, muttered, and sometimes cried out from nightmares within arm's reach of men who had nowhere else to be. A ship this small, 15, 17, 19 meters of deck, was less like a house and more like a crowded, moving room. Every argument was overheard, every confession, every prayer whispered in the dark as the creaking timbers sang along. Over weeks the men came to sense something else, that the ship was not just a vehicle, not just wood and rope and canvas, but a kind of living partner in their journey. They would not have said it in modern terms, but they listened to her. They spoke about her. They cursed her stubbornness when she lagged. They praised her when she rode out a squall more smoothly than expected. You could tell the mood of the sea from the voices of the planks. In long, calm swells, the creaks were slow and measured, like a sleeper turning in bed. In choppy, confused seas, they became jittery, rapid, as if the ship herself were anxious. When a storm bore down and the wind howled through the rigging, it could sound, for a moment in the small hours, like the bellow of some great creature straining but holding together. Wood swelled and shrank. Nails worked a little loose and were hammered back. Caulking squeezed out and had to be renewed. The ship changed under their hands day by day, as surely as they changed under the ships. So you have this: men whose skin tastes of salt, whose clothes smell of smoke and tar, whose ears are filled with wind and wood and water, lying on hard planks that rise and fall like a breathing chest. They eat, work, pray, and sleep on a creature that moans and sighs and carries them westward into a part of the world none of them has ever seen. In that endless sensory present, sound and smell and touch folding over one another, distance becomes something you feel in your bones rather than see with your eyes. Land is gone. Home is far behind. What you have, for now, is the sea, the ship, and the body you live inside of. and all of it, night after night, day after day, is preparing you for the other world you've been told lies somewhere ahead. Faith for these men was not an extra they packed along with their clothes. It was the water they swam in before they ever saw the Atlantic. Most of the crew were late medieval Andalusian Catholics. They had grown up in towns where church bells ordered the day as surely as the sun, where processions snaked through narrow streets on feast days, candles trembling in the wind, where you crossed yourself without thinking when you passed a wayside shrine, or when thunder rolled too close. On land, that rhythm had stone walls and familiar faces. At sea, on 3 small ships heading into what many still called the Mar Tenebroso, the Sea of Darkness, it became something tighter, more urgent. So the day at sea, as later summaries suggest, was stitched together with prayers. At dawn, when the sky in the east just began to pale and the stars over the stern were still bright, men were called together, bleary, yawning, some crossing themselves as they straightened up from coils of rope that had been their beds. The officer of the watch, or Columbus himself on the flagship, would lead them in the Pater Noster, the Ave Maria, perhaps the Creed. The murmured Latin rolled over the deck, some voices stumbling on words they had learned by sound more than by meaning. They faced east, toward a sun they could not yet see, toward Spain, toward home and churches and families they had left behind. At noon, when the heat baked the planks and the compass pointed its steady north, no matter how far west they steered, there might be another brief gathering, a reminder that every hour brought them deeper into waters most of them had never imagined crossing, a chance to ask, again, for protection. And in the evening, as the previous section's sounds and smells settled into their night patterns, there was the Salve Regina. This hymn, Hail, Holy Queen, had been sung on land for centuries, part of the Compline prayers that closed the day. By the 15th century it had also become especially dear to sailors. According to later accounts and the habits of Iberian crews in general, it's very likely that Columbus's men ended each day with it. Picture them, gathered as much as space allowed on the Santa Maria's deck, or in smaller knots on the Niña and the Pinta, the last light flattening on the sea, the ship rolling gently tonight. A voice begins, perhaps the ship's boy who calls the watches high and clear. Salve, Regina, Mater Misericordiae. Others join, rough and tuneless or unexpectedly sweet. The melody is simple, built to be remembered, built to carry. The words name Mary as Mother of Mercy, life, sweetness, hope. They speak of exile, of sighs and tears in this valley of tears, and ask her to turn her eyes of mercy toward them. For men who had watched their coastline sink and vanish and be replaced by nothing but water, the idea of exile was not theoretical. The hymn was devotion. It was also, though no one would have put it this way, a form of group therapy. Singing together on a small creaking deck, with the darkness pressing in from every side, turned a scattered crowd of anxious individuals into a single body for a few minutes. Breath synced, words synced. Fear, for a moment, found a shape that could be carried in sound instead of sitting silently in each chest. Over all of this stood Columbus's own faith, which was not ordinary. Most of the crew might have thought of the voyage in practical terms: wages, a royal venture, perhaps some plunder or promotion if things went well. Columbus, by his own later writings, carried something larger and stranger inside his head. In his Book of Prophecies, compiled years after this first crossing but drawing on beliefs he seems already to have held, he wove his life into a tapestry of scripture and end-times expectation. The world, as he read it, was moving toward a climax. All lands were to be brought under Christ. Wealth from new territories might fund a final crusade to retake Jerusalem. His westward mission was not merely a commercial gamble. It was part of a divine schedule. We cannot know exactly how much of this he shared aloud in 1492. But officers close to him, and perhaps some ordinary sailors listening at a respectful distance, would have heard him frame the voyage as guided by Providence. He spoke, according to later narratives, of God opening a way where none had been known, of kings and queens chosen to support that plan, of himself as an instrument. For a man shivering under a damp blanket beside the mainmast, that grand language may have felt remote, yet it also did something practical. If the admiral believed God had personally ordained this crossing, then perhaps they were less likely to vanish into an endless void. Perhaps. When the sea hissed along the hull at midnight, and the sky was full of unfamiliar stars, it could help, a little, to imagine that an invisible hand had drawn their course, because alongside orthodox faith the old stories came aboard too. These sailors did not believe, in any simple way, that the world was flat like a plate you could fall off the edge of. Educated pilots knew the earth was round. Their compasses and calculations depended on it. Late medieval cosmology, at least among navigators, accepted a sphere. But knowledge and imagination do not always walk in step. In taverns in Palos, in stories passed from older men to younger, the ocean sea to the west had been painted as a place of shadows, a sea of darkness, a region where winds might die forever, leaving ships becalmed until men starved and rotted, where great serpents coiled just under the surface, where monstrous fish with eyes like lanterns and mouths full of teeth might rise without warning and swallow a boat. Medieval maps had sometimes drawn such creatures at the limits of known waters, not because cartographers had seen them, but because they needed to fill the unknown with something. Some of the younger crew members would have grown up with those images. An older helmsman, on a quiet watch, might have told of a cousin ship that sailed too far and was never heard from again, and let the silence after the sentence suggest more than any detail could. When the bow plunged into a darker patch of water, or a strange fin showed briefly in the wake, a man's mind could supply the rest. So you have this mixture: priests' Latin and tavern tales, church doctrine and sea lore, saints and serpents occupying the same mental ocean. Then, midway across, the water itself began to change. Around mid-September, according to the abstract of Columbus's journal, the fleet sailed into stretches of ocean where the surface appeared thick with floating weed. Sargassum, we call it now, a brown branching seaweed that drifts in vast mats, cradling tiny crabs, fish, shells. To men who had never seen it, it must have been unsettling. At first it might have seemed hopeful. Seaweed meant something had grown somewhere. Perhaps it had torn loose from a coastline not far away. Men leaning over the bulwarks could rake it in with hooks, feel the slippery tangles slide over their hands, smell its faint vegetal rot. They might have called out jokes. "We can walk to shore on this, eh?" Nervous laughter, but the weed did not thin. Day after day, reports say, it stretched around them, turning the sea into a patchy, floating meadow. Winds in that region tended to be light, the sails hung less full, the ships crept rather than charged. The sensation, for men who watched the same clumps of weed slide by slowly, was of being held. Some began to worry, not about falling off the world, but about never moving forward again. Would the hulls become snagged in this endless net? Did the weed mark hidden shoals lurking just below, ready to rip their planking open far from any shore? Old phrases like cursed waters might have surfaced in whispered conversations by the rail. Columbus, whose job included managing fear as much as steering a course, reportedly reassured them. This was simply another sea, another of God's regions, not a trap. The compass still pointed, the swell still rolled. They were, he insisted, in the hands of Providence, not of plants. Still, when the wind dropped and the only movement came from the slow, languid heave of weed and wave, the unease would have crept back. Men listened harder to creaks in the hull, to slight shifts in the wind, to anything that might mean change. Under such strain, every sign took on meaning. A sudden streak of light arcing across the sky, a shooting star might draw a murmur of crossed foreheads and chests. Was it a warning? A message? A soul? A bank of cloud on the horizon, higher and darker than the rest, could become, in anxious minds, a barrier or a promise. If it looked like land, even vaguely, men would point and peer until the last trace faded in the shifting light. Most important were birds and the colour of the water. When a gull or a tern appeared far from known coasts, Columbus and his pilots took it as evidence of land nearby. Las Casas's abstract of the journal notes their careful tracking of such sightings. Ordinary sailors, too, watched the sky. They had grown up near rivers and coasts where particular birds meant fish, where certain cloud shapes meant rain. Out here they extended that habit to everything. A flock flying west at dusk, a single bird circling the mast and then darting off. Each motion was a potential message. The sea itself changed hue with depth and plankton and sky. Greenish water in their minds might mean shallower seas nearer to land. Deep ultramarine suggested fathomless depths. Columbus, experienced mariner that he was, read these shifts with a practised eye. His men, less schooled in theory, nevertheless felt them. A new colour was a new mood in the ocean, a sign that they had crossed some invisible boundary. Through it all, prayer and superstition braided together into a single rope, a sudden squall tearing at the sails. Men shouted, hauled, and at the same time muttered invocations to St. Elmo, to St. Nicholas, to the Virgin. A long calm that brought the fear of dwindling water casks and spoiled food. Someone proposed a vow. If God granted them a wind and landfall, they would walk barefoot to a shrine, or offer a silver heart, or fund a mass back home. On this first voyage, and even more clearly on later ones, Columbus's crews made such vows in storms. Las Casas records them. Whether we know the exact words or not, the pattern is clear. Faith was not only in churches, it was in calloused hands tracing a cross on a splintered rail, in lips shaping the names of saints as the ship's bow rose and fell, in eyes scanning weed-choked water for a break that might mean they were not, after all, alone in an endless plain of salt. So these men slept, when they could, between fear and devotion. On one side, images of monsters and unreturning ships, of seas that never ended. On the other, the steady repetition of familiar words, Pater Noster, qui es in caelis, Ave Maria, gratia plena, salve Regina. Somewhere in that space between terror and trust, the days passed. The sand in the glass fell. The watchers turned. The ships crept westward, seeking signs. And as their fear of the unknown swelled and ebbed like the ocean around them, the next phase of the voyage approached, the long middle stretch when tensions would sharpen, and where Columbus, quietly, would begin keeping more than one record of how far from home they really were. By the last days of September, the prayers were the same, but the space they floated in had changed. The Canary Islands were far behind them now. La Gomera left on the 6th of the month, and for almost 4 weeks no one had seen anything but water and sky. Not the familiar rhythm of coasts and ports, not islands they knew by outline, just the endless, gently moving circle of the horizon. For most of these Andalusian sailors, that was new. They were not strangers to the sea. Many had run up and down the coasts of Iberia, or crossed to North Africa, or fished in waters where land was never more than a day or two away. But this was different. Day after day, watch after watch, the shoreline in their minds grew thinner, like a memory worn smooth by being handled too often. You can imagine how the days began to blur, the same creak of timbers under bare feet, the same smell of tar and damp canvas and salted meat turning a little more sour, the same low slap of waves on the hull, the same groan of rope through blocks as sails were trimmed. Voices changed. Today the carpenter cursing softly at a stubborn plank, tomorrow 2 boys arguing over a piece of stale bread. But the backdrop did not. It was like living inside a circle you could never step outside of. The deck, the rail, the mast, the ring of water, the ring of sky, all of it moving, none of it changing. Under that kind of sameness, the mind starts to press against its own walls. Men began, according to later summaries of Columbus's journal, to count the days in their heads. 1 week, 2, 3, their rough sense of distance, built from years of coastal sailing, how far a ship normally ran in a day with this wind, with that swell, ticked along in the background. Quiet arithmetic done while coiling a rope or chewing a mouthful of hardtack, and that, Las Casas tells us, was when Columbus started keeping 2 reckonings. In the abstract he made decades later, he notes that on 9 September the admiral made 15 leagues that day, but decided to reckon fewer than he was making, so that if the journey were long the men should not be afraid and discouraged. For several days in that account there are 2 numbers, the distance Columbus believed they had actually sailed, and the smaller figure he announced aloud. By the 25th, Las Casas simply states that Columbus always pretended to the men that he was making little headway, and that he kept 1 record for himself and 1 for the crew. So picture that private ritual. Each day, near noon, the pilots on each ship did their dead reckoning, estimating distance run by the feel of the ship, the set of the sails, the speed of the wake. No logline yet, just experience turned into numbers. The compass bearing was noted. The sky was scanned for any chance of taking a latitude. Then, when the sand in the glass had been flipped and the sum was done, Columbus went to his chart and journal. Quill in hand, he wrote the higher number, the one he trusted, into his own reckoning. The line of their course, inching west across the vellum, moved more than the crew would hear about. Then he recorded, in a way meant for others, the lesser figure. A few leagues shaved away, a little deliberate shrinking of the ocean in their minds. Was this a grand deception, a neat trick that fooled hardened seamen? Modern historians tend to doubt it was that simple. The Niña and the Pinta had their own experienced pilots, men like Sancho Ruiz and Francisco Martín Pinzón, who could feel the difference between a sluggish day and a brisk one. Ordinary sailors could read the pulling weight of the tiller, the rush of water past the hull. You cannot easily convince a man who has spent his life on the sea that he has crawled when he has clearly flown. So the 2 logs, as we might call them, were probably less about blinding the crew and more about managing mood, tamping down the official tally, giving anxious men a slightly shorter number to hang their worries on. Perhaps, too, reassuring Columbus himself, splitting the difference between hope and caution on the page. Either way, the fact that he did it, or at least said later that he did, tells us something important. He could feel the tension rising. The grumbling did not start with shouted threats and drawn knives. It started with questions. According to later retellings based on the lost journal, someone would mutter near the windlass, "We must have gone far enough to find Cipango by now." Another would answer, "If there is any Cipango." Laughter, but with an edge. A man lying awake under the stars would say to his friend, "When we left La Gomera, did you think we would be this far and still see nothing?" And the friend might not answer. By early October, those murmurs had thickened into something heavier. Las Casas's abstract and later chroniclers speak of sailors saying they would never again see Spain, that the admiral's calculations were madness, that no one had ever sailed so far into the ocean sea. Some stories, written long after, dramatize this into talk of throwing Columbus overboard, of seizing a ship and turning back by force. The surviving evidence is softer. There is no clear record of an organized plot, no list of ringleaders. What seems most likely is a kind of rolling low-level resistance. Men pressing their officers, how much farther? Men going to the Pinzon brothers, who commanded great respect and saying, "You know these waters, tell him we must turn back." And this is where Martin Alonso Pinzon, captain of the Pinta, steps into the story as more than just a name. On land, in Palos, Martin Alonso had been one of the region's leading mariners. His ships, his money, and his reputation had helped make the voyage possible. Many of the sailors aboard the caravels were his neighbours, cousins, friends of friends. They knew him before they ever met Columbus. So when fear thickened the air like humidity before a storm, men did not only look toward the Santa Maria's high stern castle. They also watched the lower, quicker shape of the Pinta, watching whether her sails still followed the same course, listening for any hint that her captain wanted to turn. On 6 October, Las Casas's abstract reports, it was Martin who suggested they alter their heading a little toward the southwest, following the flight of birds. That small shift, practical seamanship reading the signs of life in the sky, also signalled to his men that he still believed in going on. When, a few days later, tension peaked, some accounts say it was Martin and his brother Vicente Yanez who helped broker a compromise. 3 more days, they told the admiral the men would accept. If no land appeared by then, they would insist on turning back. Whether those exact words were spoken, the pattern is plausible. Authority aboard the fleet was not a single straight line from Columbus downward. It was a web, with the Pinzons as crucial knots. Their choice to keep sailing west may have done as much to hold discipline together as any speech from the flagship. Meanwhile, the ocean itself was playing tricks on everyone's nerves. Cloud banks on the horizon, where warm and cool air met, could stack and flatten in ways that, from a distance, looked uncannily like low, dark land. As light shifted and the ship rose and fell, those shapes seemed to change, to grow more solid, then to melt away. Someone would cry out, "Tierra! Land!" Men rushed to the rail, squinting into the haze. Hearts thudded, hands tightened on ropes. Then, slowly, the illusion slid apart. The shoreline lifted and thinned and joined the sky. It was only cloud. Moments like that, Las Casas hints at several, would have left a sour taste. Hope spiking, then dropping, laughter afterwards, but shorter now. Next time, someone might say. And someone else might mutter, there will be no next time, only more sea. Yet even as false landfalls teased them, real signs began to gather like subtle omens. In late September and early October, Columbus's journal, as summarized, notes more and more floating things. Not just amorphous weed, but branches with green leaves still clinging, carried by currents from some unseen shore. A small board, worked by hand. On one day, a stick fashioned, they said, with a tool. Little cuts and notches no wave could make. Men hauled these trophies aboard, crowding around them. Fingers tracing the smooth edge of the wood, the still supple veins in the leaf. The smell of sap faint but unmistakable, brought a different world onto the deck for a moment. The memory of orchards, of river banks, of damp earth. Birds, too, multiplied. Not just the tireless ocean birds that could roam far from any land, but flocks that sailors associated with coasts and islands. On 7 October, Las Casas records immense flocks of birds flying to the southwest. To Columbus, steeped in older stories of Atlantic islands, this was as clear a map as any chart. Birds do not fly all night over open ocean without a place to rest, he argued. Where they go, there must be land. He pointed them out, lifting men's gazes from the empty horizon line to the moving specks overhead. See them, he might have said. God does not send us signs for nothing. Some sailors crossed themselves. Others simply watched, their thoughts unspoken. If the birds know, perhaps we are not lost. So the two currents of feeling ran side by side. On one side, fear, whispered bargains to turn back, angry speeches made in the darkness to a friend who listened without replying. On the other, scraps of hope, a carved stick, a fresh leaf, a flight of birds that suggested the world must eventually give way to something solid. Columbus's 2 logs, his public shortened distances and his private longer ones, floated atop those currents, numbers trying to tame emotions, ink lines stretching west while hearts stretched thin. Night after night the Salve Regina rose from 3 small ships in a very large sea. Night after night men lay down on damp planks, balancing on the moving edge between despair and expectation. And then, as the moon waned and October deepened, those 2 currents would converge. The limits of endurance and the first sighting of the land they had smelled and guessed and feared they might never find. By the evening of October 11, those currents of fear and hope were no longer subtle. They were the air everyone breathed. All that day the signs had been piling up. According to later summaries of Columbus's lost journal, more branches had drifted by, one with berries still clinging, small and red against the green. Another piece of wood, clearly shaped by a tool. A little staff, some said, with cuts along its length as though someone had idly notched it while talking to a friend. Men crowded the rail whenever anything floated near. Hooks went over, lines splashed, hands strained to reach. When they hauled something in, everyone leaned close. Rough fingers turned the branch, pressed the leaves, traced the grooves in the wood. You can imagine the way they must have smelled it. Sap, earth. A faint, clean greenness that did not belong to the open sea. For a moment it would cut through the usual scents of tar and sweat and old salt meat, like a distant memory of orchards after rain. Birds were everywhere now, not just single wanderers, but flocks. Small birds that didn't sleep on the wing. Birds that, in a sailor's private map of the world, meant only one thing: land within reach. Some flew low over the ship, so near that men could see the shapes of their wings against the evening sky. Others moved steadily to the west-southwest, as if following an invisible road. By late afternoon, even the most sceptical men had grown quiet. Whatever they thought of Columbus's theories, whatever they muttered about Chipango and the Great Khan, the sea itself was talking in a language they trusted. Leaves, worked wood, birds that should not be here if there were no place to rest. So when the sun slid down and the sky deepened from gold to ash to blue-black, the mood aboard all 3 ships was not like other nights. Voices, according to later accounts, were lower. Laughter had an edge of anticipation. Men on the evening watch moved a little more quickly. Those off watch did not settle to sleep quite so easily. They found excuses to stay awake, mending a bit of rigging, checking a coil of rope, sitting on a chest with their backs against the warm planks and their eyes tilted toward the dark horizon. Columbus, feeling the moment, made it official. He ordered, Las Casas tells us, that night no one was to sleep deeply. Extra vigilance on all watches. careful scanning in every direction. And he added an incentive. Besides the royal pension of 10,000 maravedis promised by Ferdinand and Isabella to the first man who sighted land, he would give, from his own resources, a fine silk doublet. For men used to rough wool and worn linen, that was not nothing. Name were written down as the first to cry, name were written down as the first to cry land. Doors might open that had always been closed. You might go home not just as a survivor, but as a man who'd been first. So the last light drained from the sky over an ocean that felt, for the first time in weeks, like it might be a road to somewhere instead of a circle with no exit. They prayed as always. The Salve Regina rose from the caravel's low decks and from the Santa Maria's higher stern, voices carrying over the dark water between them. Hail, Holy Queen, Mother of Mercy. But there was a different weight behind the words now, not only a plea for rescue, but a kind of poised gratitude in advance, as if they were already thanking God for land they had not yet seen. Wind pressed the canvas. The ships moved on. Somewhere after full dark, perhaps closer to midnight than to sunset, a long low island lay ahead in the night, still invisible to eyes but already casting its presence into the water around it. Waves changed their tone as they rolled in over unseen shoals and reefs. The smell in the air shifted, almost imperceptibly at first. More earth, more plant, a softness beneath the salt. On the Santa Maria, around what Columbus would later describe as the 10th hour of the night, roughly 10 o'clock, he claimed to see something. In the abstract Las Casas made from the Admiral's journal, he writes that Columbus saw a light, but so small a body, that he could not affirm it to be land. It appeared, he said, like a little wax candle rising and falling, as if someone were walking with it. It seemed to glow, vanish, glow again. Some men near him agreed that they too saw a faint glimmer. Others saw nothing at all. Was it a lantern on a Taino fishing canoe? A fire on a distant island flickering behind palms as people went about their night routines, entirely unaware of 3 foreign ships edging closer through the dark? Or was it a trick of tired eyes, wish and strain making patterns out of starlight and wave? Modern historians point out that, given the likely distance to the land they actually reached the next morning, if the light was real, it was probably from a different island altogether. They also note that Columbus later used this reported sighting to argue that he, not any common sailor, had technically seen land first, and that he therefore deserved the royal reward. Whatever it was, on that night it seems to have remained only a curiosity. A note filed away in the Admiral's mind and on his page. The ships did not heave to. They did not alter course. The dark closed in again, and the watches went on. Hours slid by, measured by the soft fall of sand in the glass, by the shift changes, by the low murmur of men talking quietly to stay awake. Somewhere to the north, the Pinta's bow lifted and fell in the same long swell, her hull whispering through the water. On her forward lookout, Rodrigo de Triana, Juan Rodriguez Bermejo of Lepe, peered into the darkness until his eyes ached. It was his job and his chance. Around 2 in the morning, as the half-moon rode low and the eastern sky was only just beginning to think of paling, the horizon ahead did something it had not done once in 33 days. It stopped being a perfect curve. There, faint but unmistakable to a trained eye, a darker band cut across the meeting of sea and sky. It did not move with the swell. It did not thin and swell like cloud. It just sat there, low, steady, solid. Rodrigo saw it. According to later accounts, he shouted with everything left in his chest, "Tierra! Tierra! Land! Land! Land!" The word flung out over the Pinta's deck hit men like a physical blow. They surged to the rail. Martin Alonso Pinzon, her captain, came running, grabbed a vantage point and saw it too, the dark line ahead, the pale gleam of what might be surf where moonlight caught the edge of a reef. He ordered a Lombard fired. The small cannon's report cracked across the quiet sea, the sound rolling out in a slow, heavy echo. On the Santa Maria, men jerked awake, scrambled up, staring forward. On the Niña, heads lifted from damp cloaks, hearts hammered in chests that, only the day before, had been heavy with fear of endless water. Land. Relief moved through the fleet like a wave. It is easy to imagine shouting and wild celebration, and some later narratives do describe men embracing, laughing, weeping openly. But alongside the explosion of joy there would also have been something quieter, deeper, a long breath finally released, the sense of a knot inside the chest loosening. Some crossed themselves again and again, words tumbling out. Gracias a Dios. Thanks be to God. Others sank to their knees where they stood on the tiles and planks, kissing the deck that had brought them this far. Men who had, hours before, been measuring out in their minds the long eastward run back to Spain, now stared at the unmoving darkness of land as if afraid it might melt away like another cloud. The ships reduced sail to approach cautiously in the night. Unknown shallows, unseen reefs. No one wanted to wreck within sight of a shore they had spent a month searching for. So they edged closer, feeling their way. All the rest of that night, the dark band of land stayed ahead, and slightly to the port, growing no longer imaginary but still withholding its details. Sailors dozed and woke, rising to the same astonishing realization. It was still there, and then, slowly, the sky changed. Dawn in the Bahamas, though none of them knew the name yet, comes with a soft unrolling of colour, first a hint of grey over the eastern rim, then a wash of pale blue. Then, as the sun nears, the clouds and sea and land all begin to separate from one another. What had been only a darker smudge became, as the light strengthened, a low green-brown shape, a line of shore, here and there the pale thread of a beach, above it rising like shadows against the brightening sky, the tops of trees. According to the surviving summaries, the crews burst once more into prayers, the Te Deum, the Gloria, voices hoarse from salt air, cracking with emotion. Columbus dressed in his best, as did Martin Alonso and Vicente Yanez. Standards were readied, the royal banner with its devices of Castile and Aragon, and the green cross flag that Columbus favoured, emblazoned with the crowned initials of Ferdinand and Isabella. Boats were lowered, their hulls thumping gently against the sides of the ships as they kissed the water. Oars were shipped, chosen men climbed down, officers, armed sailors, a notary to witness and record what would be done. The rest of the crew lined the rails, straining to see. The short pull to shore must have felt very long. Oars dipped and rose. The boat slid over clear, changing water. Green over shoals, deep blue where it fell away. Beneath them, if anyone looked down, fish moved in flashes of silver and colour, unlike those of the home coasts. Ahead the line of beach grew larger, sand bright and almost white, curving gently. The sound of surf, muted at sea, now thickened into a steady hush as waves folded and broke. On the shore, people were already gathering. The islanders, the Taino of Guanahani, though Columbus would rename it San Salvador, had seen the strange floating towers appear on their horizon with the dawn. Now they watched smaller wooden things, full of pale-skinned men in metal and cloth, sliding closer. Some, later accounts say, came down to the water's edge, curious rather than immediately afraid. Others hung back among the palms and the low brush, half hidden, trying to understand what they were seeing. The boats grounded, wet sand touched hull. Columbus stepped out, careful in the shallow water, followed by his men. They carried the standards. on that narrow strip of beach, with the surf at their backs and the trees just beyond, they planted the royal banner and in formal words recorded later claimed the island for Ferdinand and Isabella. They kneeled. They kissed the ground. They gave thanks aloud to God, who, in their understanding, had led them safely over the ocean sea. Around them stood people whose ancestors had walked those beaches, fished those shallows, tended those gardens of cassava and maize and fruit trees for generations beyond European counting. The Taino watched the ceremonies with a mixture of amazement and attentiveness. Columbus would later describe them, in Las Casas's abstract, as well-formed, strong and generous, noting how quickly some brought gifts of parrots, cotton thread, and simple ornaments. He also, in the same breath, mused on how easily, in his view, they might be made into Christians, into subjects. For the men from Palos and the surrounding towns, this morning was the end of an ordeal. They had not fallen off the edge of the world. They had not vanished into some nameless emptiness. They stood barefoot on warm sand under unfamiliar trees, listening to the murmur of an unknown language and the crash of waves on a new shore. In their hearts, relief and wonder, and perhaps a quick, sharp thought of home. For the people of Guanahani, though they could not yet know it, it was the beginning of something else. From this calm landing, these cautious greetings, these exchanges of food and trinkets, would unfold over years and decades a chain of events that would bring sicknesses for which they had no names, forced labour under systems they had never imagined, and the slow, terrible unmaking of ways of life that had seemed as enduring as the sea itself. But in that first morning light, on that particular beach, those futures were still hidden. What the sailors felt, and what the islanders saw, was simply this. After 33 days of nothing but water, 3 weary ships had found land, and 2 peoples were looking at one another for the first time. From mid-October into the winter of 1492 to 93, Columbus steered his tiny fleet west and south, island to island, convinced he was brushing along the outer edges of Asia. According to his own letters and the later abstract of his journal, he believed these were the Indies he had promised the crown, perhaps the outskirts of Chipango, perhaps some province of the Great Khan. To the men on deck it felt less like geography, and more like waking into different dreams of abundance. Every few days a new shore appeared, long low cays fringed with sand as white as powdered shells, larger islands lifting blue-green out of the horizon, their hills softened by haze. They dropped anchor in lagoons so clear that anchors, cables, even schools of fish were visible far below. The smell of the air changed from place to place, sometimes more floral, sometimes sharper, with the scent of dense, wet forest. The ships would lie to, straining gently at their cables, and boats would go ashore. You might be among the armed party chosen to accompany the admiral, or you might stay behind, your world narrowed again to rigging, watch, and the glimpse of land further than you could swim. Either way, the pattern repeated. New beaches beneath your feet, new paths pushing into shade where the sun fell in mottled patches through leaves you did not know the names of. Fruits cut open and handed to you, sweet in ways your tongue had never tasted. On some islands there were only a few scattered houses, canoes upturned on the sand, people who watched from a distance and then melted away. On others there were villages, houses of wood and thatch, fields of cassava and maize, paths worn smooth by many bare feet. Columbus would later praise in his letter how fertile to a marvellous degree the lands were, how many streams and groves and harbours he found. For him, every inlet was a potential port on the edge of Asia. For you they were simply strange and vivid places that appeared out of the sea, then slipped away again as sails rose and anchors came aboard. What fixed themselves more firmly in memory were the people. The Taino and related islanders you met in those weeks came down to the beaches with open hands. According to the surviving descriptions, They approached with curiosity, not with weapons drawn. Men and women, some painted, some adorned with small bits of gold leaf or hammered discs, some with parrots perched on their shoulders, stood in the shallows and watched the boats approach. Gifts crossed the thin line where sea met sand. From the ships, glass beads, tiny and bright, strung on cords, little brass bells that chimed when shaken, red caps of wool, their colour as vivid as blood in the sun. From the shore, balls of fine cotton thread, carefully spun, parrots in a riot of green and red and yellow, their claws gripping forearms and shoulders, baskets of cassava bread, roots, fruits, and, every so often, a small ornament of yellow metal, a nose-piece, a bit of leaf hammered thin, a ring. To the sailors, those exchanges were astonishing but also oddly playful. Beads that had lined chests back in Palos, bells that had seemed like meaningless trinkets, were suddenly tokens of great worth. Men watched with wonder as islanders' faces lit up at the flash of coloured glass or the jingle of metal. They laughed at the parrot's harsh attempts to mimic Spanish words, marvelling at the birds' colours as much as the islanders marvelled at the glint of steel knives. To Columbus the same scenes meant something different. In the pages preserved by Las Casas he remarked again and again on the people's generosity, how they would give what they had for whatever is given to them, and seem to lack guile. But in the same breath he wrote how they would be good servants and easily made Christians. He pressed gently through signs and borrowed interpreters, always toward the same questions. Where did the gold come from? Did they know of a great king? Was there, inland, a city? Often, islanders gestured vaguely toward the horizon or the mountains, naming distant places, Kubanacan, Babeque, Chibao. To them these words meant regions and chiefdoms in their own world. To Columbus the sounds echoed names he had read in Marco Polo. They sounded like proof that Asia lay just out of sight. When the fleet reached the great long island we now call Cuba, at the end of October, the impression of size and potential deepened. The coastline stretched and stretched. Rivers poured out of the interior. Tobacco smoke curled from village doorways. Columbus sent men inland, according to his letters, and they returned with stories of broad paths, cultivated fields, and more people, all treating them with food and hospitality. He convinced himself, at least in his written reports, that he might be near the mainland of Cathay. Then, early in December, came Hispaniola. From the sea, Hispaniola's northern shore must have seemed especially grand. Highlands inland, river mouths opening into the green interior, wide bays where the caravels could find good holding ground. Taino canoes came out toward the anchored ships, narrow and deft on the water, some large enough to hold dozens of people. Gold finally appeared not just as the occasional trinket, but in the sands of streams and in ornaments worn by local leaders. Columbus heard the name Chibao for the mountainous region inland, and struck upon it as something like Chipango, imagining the fabled islands of eastern Asia had at last come within reach. For the sailors, Hispaniola meant long days of rowing to and from shore, of cutting and carrying wood, of standing armed watch while trades and talks went on around them in a language they did not understand. But it also meant streams of sweet water to bathe in, fresh fruits in abundance, and the feeling, new since leaving Spain, that perhaps they had actually reached a place that mattered to the powerful people whose favour governed their lives. Then, on a quiet, starlit night close to Christmas, the sea reminded them how quickly it could change the course of everything. It was the night of December 24, according to later reconstructions from the Lost Journal. The Santa María was running along the north coast of Hispaniola, close enough to hear, in the pauses between creaks and murmurs aboard, the distant thud of surf on reefs. The wind was gentle, the air soft. Columbus, who had often been wakeful, chose this night to rest. He entrusted the helm to a steersman, who, Las Casas reports, passed the tiller in turn to an inexperienced ship's boy, something the rules of good seamanship strictly forbade. Slowly, too slowly for anyone drowsing on deck to notice at first, the flagship drifted off her safe line. The sea under her keel grew shallower. Somewhere below, pale coral lifted toward the surface, unseen. Then, with a sudden shudder that would have ripped sleep out of any man, the Santa Maria struck. The noise must have been like nothing you'd heard before, a deep grinding, a crack of timbers, the clatter of loose gear jolted from its place. The hull lurched, stuck fast on the coral. Men tumbled, grabbing for stays and rails. Shouts split the night, calls to the pumps, orders to lighten the ship, cries to cut away the anchor. They worked furiously in the darkness, but the sea worked more steadily. With every swell, the ship's heavy stern lifted and fell, driving her bows deeper onto the reef. Water nosed in through open seams. Soon it was clear. She was not coming off. Word went up the coast. Taino from the nearby settlement of the Cacique Guacanagari came out in canoes at first light. According to Columbus's own report, they helped without hesitation, ferrying cargo, spars, provisions, and even planks ashore. Bales of cloth, barrels of wine, iron tools, and personal chests all passed hand to hand from the doomed carrack to the sand. It was, in a sense, the most intimate mingling yet of the two worlds, an entire European ship's insides being emptied into an islander's bay under their careful assistance. With the Santa Maria beyond saving and only the Niña and Pinta still seaworthy, Columbus had to make a choice. He could not crowd all his men onto the two smaller caravels for the voyage home, not without courting disaster, and he would not abandon the foothold he believed he had gained in these new lands. So he did something that, to later historians, marks the beginning of a very different story. He decided to build a fortress. From the splintered ribs and planks of the Santa Maria, from local wood cut by European axes and carried by Taino shoulders, a small stockade rose near the shore. A handful of houses, a storehouse, a rough palisade of timber stakes. He named it La Navidad, in memory of Christ's birth and the night his flagship died. To the men detailed to stay there, about 39, if we trust Columbus's letter, it must have felt like stepping off the edge in a new way. They were soldiers and sailors used to the constant motion of ships, now told that this strip of foreign earth, under the protection of a cacique whose language they barely grasped, would be their home. They had provisions, salvaged gear, weapons, and the admiral's assurances that he would return with more men and supplies. They also had rumours of gold in the interior and the promise of freedom from immediate naval discipline. Some, as they stood inside the new palisade looking out at the sea, probably tasted opportunity. No cramped bunks, no heaving deck, land underfoot, and access to the resources of an island that seemed rich beyond measure. Others, more cautious, may have watched the Niña and Pinta ride at anchor with a tightening in the chest, understanding that whatever happened on Hispaniola in the coming months, they would face it without any easy road back to Spain. On the ships, the mood was different. Men chosen to sail home packed what little they owned, some new trinkets, perhaps a parrot or two, stories etched into memory, and looked uneasily at the winter sky. The Atlantic in January could be cruel. They had crossed it once with 3 vessels and full holds. Now they would go back with only 2 small caravels, more mouths aboard, and in their ballast a cargo of symbols, bits of gold, strange plants, a few captured parrots, and living people. For by this time Columbus had already begun seizing Taino individuals to take back as proof. Between 12 and 24, according to various accounts, were placed aboard as captives. They were, in his mind and in his letters, evidence of his discovery, souls to be presented for baptism, potential interpreters, potential labourers. To themselves, torn from families and home coasts, they were simply prisoners on wooden islands about to move out into a killing sea. That sight, the palisade of La Navidad behind you on the shore, the figures of your comrades growing smaller among the houses and timbers, the Taino canoes hovering near, and on your own crowded deck the faces of islanders who would never have chosen this voyage, was an early glimpse of what this discovery would cost. But on that day, as sails were hoisted and the caravels turned their bows back toward the rising sun, most of the men were thinking in simpler, narrower lines. The garrison watched the ship's mast dwindle on the horizon, feeling the ground steady under their feet and the weight of an unknown future gathering like clouds over the green hills. Those at sea felt the old familiar roll return, the song of rigging and hull, and the long pull of home ahead. Between them, in the small fort named for Christmas, stood the wreck's timbers, wood that had crossed an ocean and, in breaking, had rooted Europe's presence in the Caribbean shore. They did not wait long. Within days of the wreck and the raising of La Navidad's palisade, Columbus ordered the remaining 2 ships made ready. The holds were rearranged, ballast shifted, spars and rigging checked and rechecked. Men went ashore one last time to fill casks at fresh water streams, to cut a few more timbers, to say whatever awkward farewells they felt moved to say. Sometime around the middle of January, 1493, the Niña and the Pinta drew up their anchors. The Santa María lay broken on the reef not far off, her ribs now part fortress, part memory. The fort's 39 men stood on the beach or on the rough timber wall and watched the caravels gather way, the winter light catching the wet sheen of their hulls. Taino canoes hovered beyond the surf, the paddles rising and falling in the same steady rhythm as ever, even as the stranger ships turned outward. On deck, you would have felt the familiar jerk and lean as the sails took the wind, lines thrummed. The voices of the pilots carried over the water, giving courses that sounded different from the simple westward push of the summer before. This time they were not sailing blindly into rumour. This time they were aiming for home. The route, though, did not point straight east. According to Columbus's own later account and to what pilots of the day knew from Portuguese practice, the way home from these latitudes required something less intuitive. First, north. Then, only when you had climbed to the right band of sky, a turn to the northeast and east to let the great winds carry you. So in those first days, as Hispaniola's blue hills sank behind the horizon, the caravels angled up the ocean, following a course that, to a sailor who only knew the coastal waters of Andalusia, might have seemed like a strange wandering. You could not see the wind systems on any map, but you could feel them. The warm trades that had pushed you west began to slacken. The sea changed texture, the swells coming from a slightly different quarter. High clouds wrote different, colder stories across the sky. On the Niña, now Columbus's flagship, the deck was more crowded than ever. Men from the Santa María had been taken aboard. Provisions, salvaged gear, and the living evidence of the voyage, the parrots, the cotton, the bits of gold, and the Taino captives, filled the narrow spaces between mast and rail. At night, when your watch was over, there was barely room to stretch out. You might find a place under a boat turned upside down on deck, or curled against a coil of rope that smelled of tar and salt. The sea's pulse under the hull was steady but colder than on the westward crossing. The air cut more sharply through wet wool and linen. Above you the stars swung slowly in their northern arc, and every now and then one of the officers would come up with an astrolabe or quadrant, peering along its edge to fix your latitude in the sky. For a few weeks the voyage home went more easily than many may have feared. There were days of fair following winds, of the ships running free with their square sails bellied out, corkscrewing along the wide Atlantic swells. The men sang work songs in cracked voices, held rough games of chance with knuckle bones or carved wooden tokens, and talked endlessly about who would arrive first at Palos, what reward the crown might grant, which tales they would polish for taverns and family hearths. But winter at sea between continents has its own temperament. Somewhere near the latitude of the Azores in mid-February, the sky changed. According to the later abstract of Columbus's journal, the first warning was a ring around the moon, pale and haloed. Then, over several days, the wind freshened, swung, and refused to settle. Low pressure you could not name pressed down in your bones. The sea grew restless, shorter crested, chopped by cross swells. Sails were shortened, then shortened again. Lines, once soft with use, went hard in your hands. The storm that finally broke over the Niña and Pinta did not come as a sudden squall, but as a vast, mounting disorder. The wind rose and kept rising, pulling the voice out of speech, turning every shout into a shredded sound. The caravels, small and tough as they were, began to labour. Each time the bow climbed a wave, there was the sickening pause before the plunge, the green water smashing along the rail, the crash of unsecured gear as it slid and struck. On deck you would have been soaked in minutes, the cold driving through every seam. The world shrank to the width of the deck and the white roar around you. Men moved, bent double, clinging to stays and shrouds. Eyes narrowed against the horizontal spray. Orders from the quarterdeck came as gestures as much as words. Haul, slack, lash. Somewhere in that chaos, in the howling dark of a February night, the Pinta vanished. One moment her lights would have been a faint bobbing comfort off your quarter, the next they were gone, swallowed by waves and rain. You could imagine shouts on both ships, frantic attempts to signal to hold formation. But the sea does not care for human lines. The Niña and the Pinta were ripped apart by moving walls of water and driven onto separate tracks across the Atlantic. On the Niña, realization sank in slowly. If one ship went down now, no other eyes would ever see it. The ocean that had carried you to lands no one in Europe had described before might now close over you without a trace. No bodies washed ashore, no broken mast on a familiar beach, just absence. It is in this context that later writers place the scene of the vows. Las Casas, working from Columbus's lost log, describes the men gathered, as much as they could gather on such pitching deck, and casting lots to assign pilgrimages and offerings they would make if they survived. One vow was to go, barefoot and in shirts, in solemn procession to the first shrine of Our Lady they reached on Spanish soil. Another was to fast on bread and water, another to keep vigil at Santa Clara in Mogur, another to visit Our Lady of Guadalupe or of Loreto. Names of saints and holy places passed from mouth to mouth, half prayer, half bargain. In the middle of the storm's blind fury, men clung not just to rigging, but to these imagined futures in which they had lived to fulfill their promises. Columbus himself, for all his usual confidence, appears in the surviving reports as deeply shaken. At the height of one of these tempests, with waves so high that they seemed, in his own later words, to bury the ship in valleys of water, he is said to have done something quietly desperate. According to that tradition, he sat down in the cramped shelter of the cabin, on a deck that would not stop moving, and wrote. In hurried script he set down an account of the islands he had found, the route he had taken, the lands and peoples now described for the first time in European ink. He addressed it to the Catholic monarchs, folded the parchment, wrapped it in oilcloth or waxed linen to keep the sea out, and sealed the bundle in a small wooden cask. Then, with a final prayer, he had the cask carried up and heaved over the side into the raging water. It is hard to know how literally to take this story. The journal is gone. The barrel was, if it ever existed, lost to the currents. But the image has clung to the voyage's memory. A single container, bobbing for a while between mountains of water, bearing words that might outlive the men who wrote them, a kind of message in a bottle from the edge of one world to the centre of another. In the end, the Niña did not need that final courier. Battered, spars creaking, some sails reduced to ragged patches, she rode out the blows. Days later, when the wind at last diminished, and the sky began to show blue between shredded cloud, land appeared, low and hesitant at first, then firmer, the Azores. Anchoring there, in those familiar Portuguese islands, must have felt like stepping briefly into another calmer reality. The sea moderated in the shelter of the land. The constant motion softened. Men could hear their own voices again without shouting. According to accounts, some of the crew went ashore to fulfill the first of their vows, processing barefoot to a small church. Local officials, wary or simply following orders from Lisbon, detained a number of them for questioning. For a few tense days the Niña lay almost empty of hands, sitting lightly at her anchor while her scattered crew argued their case on land. Eventually most were released and brought back aboard. Columbus, not eager to linger in ambiguity, ordered the anchors weighed again. The caravan of waves resumed, this time carrying the Niña northeast toward the coast of Europe. Another storm blew them eastward more quickly than intended. The ship, driven before the wind, missed the safer approach to Castile, and instead found herself, early in March, off the mouth of the Tagus River, Portugal's own watery road to its capital. Columbus, with no choice, took shelter there and requested permission to come up to Lisbon. In that grey river light, with low shores slipping by and other ships lying at anchor, Portuguese caravels rounder and broader than the Niña, you would have felt a strange mix of foreignness and familiarity. The smell of tar, the creak of timbers, the cries of gulls were the same as in Palos, but the flags, the tongues on nearby decks, the churches on the hills were not yours. According to multiple sources, Columbus was summoned to speak with King John II. The conversation itself has been coloured by later retellings. The Portuguese king questioning, perhaps sceptical, perhaps irritated that a Genoese sailing for Castile had crossed waters his own captains had long plied. Columbus, for his part, asserting that he had found islands to the west, rich lands he believed lay on Asia's edge. For you, an ordinary sailor, this royal audience would have been only a rumour reaching the deck in fragments. Another story to turn over while you scrubbed salt from rope and patched worn canvas. From Lisbon, once the winds and politics allowed, the Niña sailed south and west along the familiar Iberian coast. The weather in those last days eased. Swells grew longer and more regular. The colour of the sea shifted toward the green-brown you knew from home waters. Coastal birds began to appear, gannets, gulls, perhaps the odd cormorant, with their particular cries. The smell of land rode the breeze in faint traces. Earth, distant wood smoke, the resin of pine. Meanwhile, the Pinta, which had survived the storms on her own course, had already found Spain. She slipped into Bayona in Galicia, spreading the news there first, before turning south toward Andalusia. Her captain, Martín Alonso Pinzón, who had been so crucial to the voyage, leading, cajoling, sometimes disputing Columbus's decisions, was by then gravely ill, weakened by fever and strain. On the morning of March 15, 1493, roughly 7 months after 3 ships had slipped past the bar of Saltes, 2 small caravels came back. Imagine that harbour at Palos. The same low shores, the same monastery of La Rábida watching from its ridge, the same familiar silhouettes of fishing boats and small traders at anchor. But now church bells were ringing in patterns of celebration. People lined the banks and crowded the quays. Families of the sailors, townsfolk, monks, curious onlookers from nearby villages who had come to see if the rumours were true. The Niña and Pinta, salt-streaked, patched and scarred, glided in on the tide. Their flags, according to some accounts, bore strange devices and perhaps a banner announcing the islands of the Indies. The men on deck were thinner, more sun-darkened, but undeniably present, their faces picked out against the sails. From shore, wives and children and parents scanned the decks for single figures. From the ships, men leaned over the rails, peering for familiar faces on land. The mood, if we trust contemporary letters, was close to astonishment. Not only had the expedition returned when many had quietly assumed it would vanish, but it brought word of lands no one in Palos had ever imagined so concretely. Islands covered in forests that stayed green all year, rivers without frost, people who wore gold as ornaments and painted their skin in colours no one here had names for. The sailors went ashore into that warm, chaotic welcome. Some walked barefoot in fulfilment of their storm vows, processing to nearby shrines. Others simply embraced whoever reached them first and staggered, still half adjusted to the solid ground, toward the nearest tavern, the nearest table, the nearest bed that did not move. Within days, Columbus himself would be riding inland, bearing letters to the royal court, already shaping the story of what he had found into the form that would echo across Europe. Most of the men who had shared the cramped decks and the long watches did not follow him into that broader history. They slipped back into their old trades, fishing, coastal shipping, small ventures to Cadiz or down the African coast. They carried quietly memories of parrots' cries in the rigging, of warm island rain, of the peculiar soft feel of Caribbean sand under their bare feet. Around hearths and on wharves, they told fragments of these memories in the years that followed, stories that blurred and shifted as sleep and time softened their edges. Not all who had made the great outward crossing lived long in this new, celebrated peace. Martin Alonso Pinzon, according to chroniclers, reached Palos almost at the same time as Columbus, coming up the river in a weakened state. He is said to have gone to La Rábida, the monastery that had sheltered the expedition's early planning, and there, worn down by fever, perhaps from infections contracted on the voyage, perhaps from the sheer accumulation of stress and labour, he died within days. Later writers speculated about causes, whispering of diseases brought back from the islands, but certainty is elusive. What is clear is that the man who had commanded the swift Pinta, who had helped hold the crews together when fear ran high in mid-ocean, didn't live to see how far the ripples of this voyage would spread, and far away, across that same ocean, on the north coast of Hispaniola, the little fort of La Navidad stood with its walls of ship timber and local wood. Inside it, 39 Europeans were beginning their own strange, precarious life among the Taino chiefdoms, trading, arguing, exploring, making choices that would never be recorded in detail. Columbus had left them with promises that he would return quickly, with more men, more supplies, more tools. He did return less than a year later, leading a much larger fleet. When he came back to that bay in late November 1493, the surf still broke on the reef where the Santa María had torn herself open. The palm still moved in the trade wind, and the river still emptied its fresh water into the sea. But La Navidad was no longer a living outpost. The palisade was burned. The houses were gone. The garrison, every one of the 39, was dead. Later reconstructions from Columbus's letters and other testimonies suggest quarrels among the men, rivalries over gold and women, raids on neighbouring villages, and eventually a decisive response from Taino forces. The first permanent European foothold in the Caribbean had lasted only months. For the sailors who had come home on the Niña and Pinta, this news, when it reached them, must have added a dark, unsettling layer to their memories. The voyage they had made, with its nights of stars and storms, its first glimpse of strange shores, had already become legend in the taverns of Palos. But the story did not end with their return, nor with the cheers on the quay. It continued, out of their sight, in places where the Atlantic swells still rolled toward foreign sand. You, listening now, can feel the arc of that first crossing and return, the leaving, the long westward push, the island harbours, the wreck and the hurried fortress, the winter storms and desperate vows, the landfall in Europe, and the homecoming into a harbour that was the same and no longer the same. A loop closed, but also opened, because what those small caravels had done was stitch two worlds together with a seam of wind and water that could never again be fully unpicked. You have ridden that seam now, in imagination, if not in body. You have stood on the crowded deck of a caravel, where men really did sleep in the open, wrapped in cloaks that never quite dried. You have felt, at least in your mind's hands, the rough grain of wet rope, heard the low mutter of prayers and curses, the slap of loose canvas in a slackening wind. You have followed them from Palos to the Canary Islands, watched the familiar coastline fall away, and then lived, day after measured day, with nothing but water to every horizon. You have watched the mood on board turn and turn again, confidence to unease, unease to open fear, then to the taut, brittle patience of men who have decided they will see this through because there is no other direction to go. You have smelled the sour casks and the salt meat, the ever-present tar and sweat, felt the ship's small wooden world roll under your feet until even solid ground seemed, for a moment, to sway. And you have stepped off with them onto those Caribbean beaches, under trees none of them had words for, in front of people whose lives had followed their own rich, complicated paths long before any European name was breathed across that sea. For the sailors, this was discovery and astonishment. For the Taino communities who met them, it was the first sign of a tide that would, over the next generations, bring war, forced labour, and the invisible armies of old-world disease. According to later estimates, whole chiefdoms in the Caribbean would be thinned to a fraction of their former numbers. One voyage, a few dozen men on 3 small ships, became the opening page of what historians now call the Columbian Exchange. 2 worlds suddenly and violently linked. Both of these truths sit together in the wake of 1492. There was real courage in sailing west into waters your charts did not truly know, in crossing an ocean in vessels hardly longer than a modern bus, guided by dead reckoning, simple instruments, and a steady trust in wind and current. There was also real harm in what that courage enabled, systems of tribute, conquest, and dispossession, whose consequences indigenous peoples still remember and resist. The same swell that lifted those caravels also carried their shadows. As you lie here now, wherever you are, you have made that crossing with them and returned. If you're still awake at this point, you're welcome to stay in this quiet a little longer. If you drifted off somewhere mid-Atlantic, you have simply done what many of those sailors must have wished for on long night watches, slipped gently out of the wind and into sleep. If you'd like to support more journeys like this, you can help in simple ways. You can tap like or subscribe so that the next voyage finds its way back to you. You can leave a comment if you wish, telling us where in the world you're listening from and whether you reached landfall awake or fell asleep somewhere between Palos and the Indies. There is also an option to join the channel as a member for those who want to support this work more directly, but that is entirely optional. Your presence here, your time and attention are already enough. So let the story settle now. Picture the harbour of Palos again, but emptied of crowds. The shouts have faded. The taverns are quiet. The Niña and the Pinta lie at anchor on a still night, their hulls no longer straining into the unknown, just rocking gently on the familiar tide. A lantern swings at each masthead, its light soft against the dark. On shore, the monastery of La Rábida is a pale outline on its hill. Above all of it the sky opens, full of the same stars those sailors watched 5 centuries ago, unchanged. Above you, too, those stars are burning, whether you can see them or not. The ocean between then and now has been crossed and crossed again. For this moment, you are simply resting in its long, slow breath, held between the rise and fall, between departure and return. Let the water grow calm, let the rigging fall silent, let the wake smooth out behind the ship until there is only a wide, dark plain, and the soft, regular sound of your own breathing carrying you on,